First off, thanks for coming in. It's always a pleasure to be here. My paper I'm presenting today is called The Dwight Effect. My co-author is Eric Weiss, who will be joining me for questions in a few minutes. But before I begin, I want to thank Eric and the people at Stats who helped this project, Brian Kopp, Ryan Warkins, Ryan Shea, David Sherman. And I also like to remind everybody this is a student-run conference, and it's a great conference. And so everybody put the research paper, everything to do with the research paper contest, and Alex especially, they've done a great job. So basketball is a two-sided sport. Defense is really important. Players compete on both offense and defense, and this is obvious. And the two core stratagems of NBA basketball are to score points and to prevent points. And here we see my favorite defensive player, who will get a lot of time here. And Greg Steems being reminded that defense is important in the restricted area. The problem is that contemporary basketball expertise is sort of hindered by our inability to characterize defensive play. So we're not very good at characterizing defensive play. When we think about conventional basketball stats, this is an old basketball card. I hand-picked this card, Bob Kaufman. I don't know much about him. But when we think about sort of the baseballification and the baseball cardification of NBA statistics, we look at games, field goals, free throws, rebounds, points, assists. Not many defensive categories on basketball cards. So most defensive analytics to this day remain sort of guided by the simple tallying of disparate event types, including steals, blocks, defensive rebounds, which does little to actually characterize the nature or the ability of a defensive player, in the same way that errors in baseball don't do a really good job of telling you if someone is a good defensive player. And so our project is really guided by two basic questions. Who is the best interior defender in the NBA, and what metrics would you use to answer that question? So everybody can think of that. You know, Dwight Howard gets a lot of love, as he is in this picture, playing really good interior defense. But this paper is a little different. We're going to explore defensive evaluations in the NBA through a new lens. We're going to present a methodology that looks at SportView data and tracks interior defensive play. And we had two real objectives that we wanted to accomplish with this paper. Number one, to improve the characterization of interior defense in the NBA. And number two, to expose the challenges and the real difficulties that are going to emerge as people try to do this, because people are going to try to do this more and more. So keep that in mind. This is a first step. And one, yeah, we want to make some sense of defense, especially in the interior in the NBA. But two, we also want to start thinking about measuring defense with these new data sources and reveal what are the big challenges so we can get better at it. So anyway, as some of you may know my work, I'm all about spatial stuff. Spatial, spatial, spatial. That's my thing. And I make graphics like this. This is overall shooting patterns in the NBA in terms of efficiency, field goal percentage. And one of the basic findings of my project last year is that the NBA is essentially a 40% league outside of 7 feet. Everybody shoots about 35 to 40% outside 7 feet. The only place on the court where players make more than half of their shots is this special little place near the basket. Right? That's the sacred real estate of the NBA. It's the most vigorously defended portion of the court in any basketball game, right? That's why we're looking at it. But traditionally, it's been very difficult to evaluate defense in that area. So these are SportView cameras. Many of you know this, many of you don't. Here we see them in Minnesota, where apparently the Timberwolves, I know we have some T-Wolf staff here, using SportView to monitor the dance team. They're really advanced. But the Rockets Power Girls are way ahead. Daryl's been working on dance team analytics for years. So anyway, these cameras are really revolutionizing at least part of the way we evaluate play in the NBA, and it's really exciting, but it's also really challenging. So what we did for interior defense with this data was to look at 2 case studies, what we call basket protection, and we'll start with that one. So when a big guy is near the basket, how are the opponents performing? We wanted to find players who reduce shot activity, and we wanted to find people who reduce shot efficiency. So one of the points I'm going to make here today is that the best interior defenders prevent shots from even happening. The best interior defenders prevent shots from ever happening. So we drew a 5-foot radius around the basket, and we said, when there is a defending big man in this area, how are the shots? How well are the opponents shooting? Where are they shooting from, and are they going in? So this is our first case study. So this was over 26,000 shots from the last 2 years. A qualifying defender had to be within 5 feet of the basket. And the first thing was frequency. The most intimidating interior defenders, even in a pickup game, prevent people like me from even wanting to go to the basket, right? This is intimidation. This is analogous to Revis Island in the NFL. If you have Godzilla underneath the basket, you're not going near that, right? We don't have Godzilla, but we have some really big guys in the NBA. And we wanted to say, who is changing the spatial behavior of offenses the most? And this is something that doesn't show up in blocks, and I like to think of them as sort of invisible blocks. I don't like that term, but you get the idea. If you're making opponents settle for mid-range shots at a higher rate and attempt fewer close-range shots, that's one way of limiting their effectiveness. So the Dwight effect is just that. When you change or reduce the spatial configurations, the efficiency of your opponent's spatial shooting configuration. And Dwight Howard was by far the best at this. We'll get into some statistics later. The other way to reduce your opponent's scoring in the interior or overall is to reduce their efficiency when they're shooting down there. So we're not talking about the person who's the best at reducing the efficiency or disrupting these shots is not Dwight Howard, it's Larry Sanders, and this is what we call the Larry Sanders show. How good is he? Well, let's look at some data. So overall, when there's a qualifying defender near the basket and NBA players shoot near the basket, they're making over 50% of their shots. But depending on who that defender is, we get very different information. When Larry Sanders is defending the basket, opponents score at a much lower rate. So not only does he lead the NBA in blocks, he reduces the efficiency of a lot of shots that aren't blocked. And I would say that's markedly more significant than blocks because it happens a lot more frequently. So overall, NBA shooters make 49% of their attempts when a qualifying defender is in this space. However, this number drops to 38% when Larry Sanders, or Roy Hibbert, by the way, is that qualifying defender. The flip side of this is that some guys are really kind of bad. Louis Scola and David Lee, opponents make 63% of their shots when they're near the basket. One of these guys is an all-star and makes a lot of money. We have this information for a lot of players now. I think it's pretty interesting. I don't pretend it to be the be-all, end-all, but I made a little video tribute to David Lee's interior defense this week. So I was watching this game Sunday after the Daytona 500. No, these are the first three possessions I watched, and I'm sorry to any Golden State people here, I am. I turned on the game after I didn't watch the Daytona 500, and I watched the first three possessions. So the first one he gets out of the way, that's fine. This one, I don't know what's going on. I'm not a game film expert, but watch, he's guarding this. After this rebound, he's guarding Derek Williams, and he gets out of the way. We're going to run that back one more time. Yeah. And that's what I call the Golden Gate. And now, one more. This is what I call the WTF rotation. Okay, this is the next trip down, by the way. These aren't... All right. Thanks. So back to the good players. So that study really suggests that I think there's two ways of being a really good interior defender, or at least two roads to get to the same dominance. There's the Larry Sanders method, which is you're going to shoot 35% when I'm around you. And then there's the Dwight Howard effect that says you're not going to shoot when I'm down there. Now, Dwight's pretty good in efficiency, too. I think he was 45%, which was significantly lower than league average. So it's not as if guys are scoring effectively when they shoot near Dwight either. But the point here is shot blocks are one thing. These are two other ways to sort of characterize how dominant a player is in these situations. So the second case study is looking at what we called shot proximity. So this can happen anywhere near the floor, and the first thing we wanted to look at there was who gets near the shots the most. So some defenders, especially help side defenders, come out of nowhere or help their, what Eric calls a defensive assist when Serge Ibaka gets a block shot a lot on Kendrick Perkins's man, right? That's fair to say. So he's very active. He attacks shots, and some guys don't do that, and that's another thing we can look at with this data. And then the second thing is back to efficiency, but anywhere in the court, who reduces the efficiency of the opponent the most? So again, these shots can happen anywhere. The qualifying criterion here, are you near the shot? Are you within 5 feet of the shot? And so some NBA players get near a lot of shots, and that's why they get a lot of blocks, in part, also because they're good at blocking shots. But Serge Ibaka is a very active defender. And in fact, he came out in the top 3 or 4 in this study. He gets near 35% of all shots when he's on the floor. So more than 1 out of 3 shots, he's within 5 feet of on the floor, which is, I think, highest or second highest in the league. Larry Sanders, 33%. Some guys much lower. Dwight Howard, for the record, 24%. So a lot of times, this idea of a potential block, how many shots were you getting near, is an interesting idea, too. So, of course, the flip side is, Larry Sanders, again, shows up number 1 in this study in terms of efficiency. So we calculated what we called, so we talked about frequency, right? Serge Ibaka gets near a lot of shots. Larry Sanders gets near a lot of shots, but we also did efficiency. So Larry Sanders also reduces the efficiency of the opponent the most. So we call this proximal field goal percentage. What is the field goal percentage of the opponent when there's a qualifying defender in that space? Opponents shoot 35% when Larry Sanders is near them. 43% when Dwight Howard is near them. The league average is 48% when there's a qualifying big man within 5 feet. Surprisingly, some guys who have pretty good reputations of defenders showed up really poorly in this study. When Anderson Varejao was that guy, which he is a lot, opponents shoot 54%. That's a 20% difference between Larry Sanders and Anderson Varejao. So one of the things Eric and I noticed was a lot of these guys were really big, elite rebounder types. And it provoked this question that we haven't looked at, but it's provocative. Who else was in there? Kevin Love? Some of these other... Yeah. David Lee, also really high field goal percentage when you're around. These are great rebounders, and the question is, are they conceding shots in favor of trying to get rebounds? We're not prepared to answer that question definitively. I hope somebody else does. That's interesting. And that's stuff we can start to look at. So when we talk about these studies in general, remember, we wanted to better characterize interior defense a little bit. Thanks. And our main finding is that in the world of blocks and basketball cards, we're not really good at identifying dominant interior defenders. We're going to get better with this SportView technology, but there's a lot of challenges. This was just putting our toe in the water of a new area of basketball understanding. There's huge challenges with the data. I know a lot of people in this room know that. But yeah, that one question, we look at David Lee conceding shots, but he always is getting a lot of rebounds. Anderson Varejao, Eric watched a lot of film, he concedes a lot of shots when he's near a shooter in favor of maybe rebounding. So that's a future question. Are these elite defensive rebounders actually bad defenders? As I said, I'm not prepared to make a statement about that, but I think it's worth looking into. There's certainly incentives in place for you to get a lot of rebounds in this league, right? If you get 20 rebounds a night, you're going to get paid David Lee money. So Kevin Love, David Lee, Varejao, these are three guys who had really bad proximal field goal percentage. Dwight Howard, who has also led the league in rebounding, if I'm correct, has very good proximal field goal percentage. So it's not all rebounders that are doing this. Larry Sanders, I think, has a pretty good defensive rebounding rate, too. When I was on with the Dan Lebitard show a couple days ago, which was a real treat, he immediately found that Andrea Bargnani was rated high in one of the rankings and drilled me on it. He's like, Kirk, you have Andrea Bargnani as the second best defender in the NBA, which is not what I have. But Bargnani's a really good case study because he has really low proximal field goal percentage. When he's around, guys don't make shots. What's his problem? He doesn't get around them that often. He doesn't get, so he's actually at the very, so we have to aggregate some of this stuff. And we're not there yet, but we're pretty happy with what we got for this study. So Dwight Howard and the Dwight Effect, I think, is something that we sort of should start looking at in all aspects of basketball. How do different choices affect the spatial nature of the basketball game that's unfolding? The mere presence of Dwight Howard induces the highest rate of mid-range shots of any other player in the league. Those are the worst shots on the floor. Don't tell LaMarcus Aldridge I said that. But yeah, he gets a lot of sort of, he has a reputation, guys don't want to challenge him maybe. So, now, before you guys tell me why my project is bad, I'll tell you why my project is bad. This is, again, not an attempt to be some kind of be-all, end-all, or introduce some sort of new library of ensemble of statistics that are going to revolutionize how we think about basketball. That's not what we're intending to do with this paper. We're sticking our toe in the water of a really exciting growth area for basketball analytics, which is defense, using spatial, using SportView. With that in mind, there's some key limitations to acknowledge. The sample, so SportView, as many of you know, is only in 15 arenas right now. So a lot of the players are only in there when they're playing road games. Some players are way overrepresented, some players are really underrepresented, and that messes with the stats, obviously. So this is not a sort of rigorous sample from a scientific point of view. So this imbalanced, incomplete, and/or biased sample needs to be brought up here. The next step to do that we didn't do is correlating this to defensive efficiency or points per possession in a way. That's an obvious next step. Correlating it to winning would make a lot of sense, and aggregate those frequency and efficiency numbers. We were limited by time and space. There's 6 pages, especially when you like to make a lot of pretty pictures in your papers. It goes away real fast, so we didn't have a lot. We actually did a lot more analysis that didn't make the paper, including what we called closeout distance, which showed how far a player traveled in the second before the shot. And some guys really attack those shots. But due to the spatial constraints of the paper, we couldn't put that in. So too much information, too little time, too little space. Another sort of more conceptual limitation of SportView data in general, and I'm a big advocate of SportView, but people aren't XY coordinates. I like to remind people that Serge Ibaka is a three-dimensional creature with arms and legs that jumps. And a lot of the times, even advanced stats make a big assumption that a human being is an XY coordinate pair that is just a little discrete point on a map. That's not true. That's not true. Where is Dwight Howard? Dwight Howard is not no-dimensional. The reason he's really good at defense is because he's giant, right? And so there's a lot of work to do. How do we actually represent the human being, not as a geometry coordinate? And so anytime you reduce people to coordinates, you're making a lot of assumptions. And lastly, the biggest limitation is we barely know what we're doing, but nobody else does either. So we're just happy to be here. We're happy to say, hey guys, what do you think? We want feedback. We want to improve this study, and we want to go forward. All right. And my last slide is conclusions. Defense, defense, defense. That's the future. Spatial, spatial, spatial. Spatial is special. That's the future. And I think there is a legacy of that baseball cardification of basketball statistics that causes us to undervalue players like Larry Sanders because he doesn't show up in the quote-unquote box score. And I know some teams are way ahead of me there, but you see what I mean? Even as fans and media, David Lee's an all-star. Larry Sanders is not. And I think that's an interesting way to frame what's going on with basketball analytics. Are we properly evaluating guys like Larry Sanders or Dennis Rodman? So I'm going to stop because I'm out of time. And if you have questions, there's going to be a microphone here, and you can come up, and I'm going to invite Eric up.
First off, I want to say great presentation. My first question is in terms of this whole Dwight effect, and you're talking about not getting the recognition, sort of in terms of the all-star knowledge that David Lee has versus Larry Sanders. Don't you find that the Defensive Player of the Year award encompasses all that? Whereas Dwight Howard gets it for 2 years in a row, likely this year will be Larry Sanders. So do you not find that the recognition they get for their defense...
Who wins the non-defensive player of the year? Who wins the worst defensive player of the year award?
Oh, that's true.
Who wins the 83rd best defensive player of the year? We need more than a trophy to understand defense.
That's my first question. My second question would just be, did you take a look at seeing any other wing players such as LeBron James or what his defensive or spacing tendencies are?
We didn't do perimeter. We focused on interior defenders specifically for this because of the value of that, what we call inside the egg, those close range shots. But it's definitely something we want to do, not only from a defensive impact standpoint, but also what we didn't get into is the idea of the total team defensive impact, which is the fact that no matter what an individual does, it's how he does it in concert. We're looking at Varejao. Maybe Varejao's decision-making is being influenced by whoever he's working with in tandem, so that that individual field goal defense is not as important as the aggregate result. And so perimeter players play into this too, because their tendencies, individual tendencies on how they attack the defensive tendencies relative to, what is it, that over 70% number of positive effect inside the egg, which is 70% of lead to baskets, fouls, and offensive rebounds. We want to see how individuals, the way in which they're playing influence that number.
Dre from Wages of Wins, great talk. My one question, I've been loving all of your research and all of this. When are we going to start seeing free throws, fouls incorporated in all of your great chart data?
No, I should add that as a limitation. And to be honest, fouls sort of, I should talk to people who are here, but they're a pain in the rear end, to deal with when you're doing stuff like this. But Larry Sanders fouls a lot, and that's a key limitation. So yeah, next year I promise we'll do foul stuff. It's a huge limitation. It's a great point. Thank you,
guys. Great research. My question is to both of you: were there any surprises for you? I mean, obviously Larry Sanders leading the league in rebounding, Dwight Howard, multi-time defensive player. Were there surprises in terms of better than maybe advertised or shockingly worse than advertised?
Yeah, I'm gonna say I didn't know that Roy Hibbert was as good as he was, but that could just because I'm not very smart. But Eric has a couple examples.
Well, for both of us, one of the big things that happened is we're looking at trying to come to terms with the Serge Ibaka frequencies, because he's attacked 74% of the shots against him when he's on the court are in the egg. So basically people are coming at him. And when we're starting off with this whole concept of the Dwight effect and intimidation, the idea of not challenging someone, yet someone who, by all accounts is a very good defender, is being attacked at something like 45% more. You're trying to figure out, okay, well, what does that mean? Does that mean he's a bad defender? And so watching film a little bit and trying to understand some things, you come up with some theories, more research to be done, but looking at Dwight and Ibaka and trying to figure out, well, what's their relative value considering this huge discrepancy. One of the things you notice is looking at all the spatial ranges, which is nice, is that Oklahoma City defends the other spatial ranges very well, and Ibaka is able to play a high degree of minutes while still maintaining activity and not fouling out, whereas in Dwight's case, the other spatial ranges, the shooting percentage, even though it was the highest mid-range percent, in terms of frequency, those ranges were also very high in terms of conversion efficiency too. So Dwight's teammates weren't effectively taking advantage of the Dwight effect as much as Dwight was having his own Dwight effect, whereas strategically the collective team, this is just a hypothesis of what we want to do, but trying to figure out why someone would be attacking that much more frequently, yet not getting efficiency improvements. They're still not converting. So that was very surprising, and it took a while to kind of wrap an explanation around it.
So unfortunately, we're out of time, but thank you both of you for a great presentation.
Thanks, guys.